Regirock, Registeel, Reggieice, Regieleki, Regidrago, and their leader, creator, father, Regigigas. These remain some of, if not the most mysterious group of Pokemon as of 2026. And while some clarification regarding them has come around, like introducing Regigigas as their creator in Generation 4, they're still largely an enigma. Why did Regigigas make the Reggies? What did they do to deserve imprisonment? I hope to answer all of these and more in this video. Now, this is a very different video than what I usually make. Normally I would make some kind of Fakemon video, or more recently something related to Silksong, not a video essay like this. But this is just too good of an idea I had, so I couldn't pass it up. Also, not everything I say here is 100% canon, so just make sure to take that with a grain of salt, some more than others. But with that being said, let's get into the video. Starting things off, I would like to start with what the Reggies are and how to obtain them in-game. Starting in Generation 3, Ruby and Sapphire, there were only 3, Regirock, Registeel, and Reggieice, or Reggieice, however you want to pronounce it. However, a decent amount of people had no idea they even existed. Not only could you only find them in random caves throughout the region, once you made it to these caves, the instructions on how to summon them was in Braille. And while I don't want to sound like a broken record, since everyone talks about the Reggies mentions this, but these games came out in a time without the internet, so either you knew Braille already, used the Braille translator in the manual, which no you didn't, most people threw away the manual anyways, or try and figure it out by yourself. And given how specific these instructions are, that last one's pretty unlikely. But if you are finally able to crack the puzzle, you are rewarded with a fight with some of the most bizarre-looking Pokemon to date. These are massive golems with a series of dots for a face. Ken Sugimori once said that a good Pokemon design has to look like you could befriend it in some way, so that way even the most hardcore and edgy designs have something a little silly to balance them out. This rule was intentionally broken in 2016 with the Ultra Beasts, interdimensional aliens, were designed. They were meant to look foreign, uncanny, and unnatural. I believe that the designers had a similar idea when making the Reggies. Despite being made of very natural materials, their unconventional faces make a series of dots and cries in the anime are so unnatural to the point where it has to be intentional. And combined with the extremely difficult puzzle you must conquer before meeting them, it almost feels like this is some kind of abomination you were never meant to see. See, in Generation 4, you could never actually encounter Arceus legitimately. You had to crack the game open in order to encounter it. And while the Reggies are, of course, in the game, I think something similar is kind of at play here. In the following generation, we are able to meet with their creator, Regigigas. However, unlike the other Reggies, Regigigas doesn't appear to be made of any raw material. Instead, its body is primarily white, with large amounts of black as well as gold and green accents. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because that description also could be used to describe Arceus, the god Pokemon. And if you think about it, the two aren't as different as you might think. Aside from their colors, they're also both creators. Arceus created the universe and everything in it. Meanwhile, Regigigas created the 5 Reggies from its environment. Snowpoint Temple, the place where you fight Regigigas in most games it's in, also has some parallels to Spear Pillar, where you fight Arceus, but I want to come back to this point eventually. And if you've ever tried to use the Regigigas, you would probably know that its ability, Slow Start, is one of the worst abilities in the game, one of the few abilities that actively hurts the Pokemon with it, cutting its attack and speed in half for the first 5 turns. And while its 160 attack stat is pretty high, there are plenty of other Pokemon with higher attack and speed stats with helpful abilities, so why does Regigigas specifically get one that hurts it? Well, I think it was given that ability on purpose, not by Game Freak, but by Arceus itself. See, creating life is something we in the business call playing God, and in many media, claiming oneself to be a god often results in undesirable consequences. And while it isn't quite the same thing, Regigigas' cry, especially in the anime, sounds completely distorted with constant pitch and speed changes, reminding me quite a lot of the story of Babel. For those unaware, the story of the Tower of Babel is a story of a civilization of people who built a massive tower as high as they could with the purpose of reaching heaven. God was offended by this and, as punishment, jumbled up their speech, turning their one language into many. Another religious story that it could be related back to is the story of Atlas in Greek mythology. According to myth, Atlas was a powerful titan, sound familiar, who betrayed the god of Olympus and, as punishment, was forced to hold up the skies. However, when we think of Atlas, we often think of the sculpture where he's holding up the entire world. And while it, again, isn't exactly the same, multiple of Regigigas' dex entries mention it pulling the continents together where they currently are. So, what I'm saying is that Regigigas committed a crime against Arceus in creating the Titans and, as punishment, was forced to pull the continents together. One hole in this theory is that there are plenty of other man made Pokemon Magnemite, Magearna, Mewtwo, that one we'll come back to later. So, if humans were able to create their own life just fine, then why was Regigigas punished for doing the exact same thing? Well, before I answer that, there are two more Titans I've yet to talk about. Those ones being the ones introduced in the Sword and Shield Crown Tundra DLC, Regieleki and Regidrago. While the three Reggies introduced in Ruby and Sapphire were made of purely natural material, rocks, ice, and metal, although Registeel looks more like refined metal and not the raw ore, but we're going to ignore that. These two were made from pure energy. First, Regieleki, which has some somewhat contradictory dex entries, which states that it's made from pure electrical energy, while the other implies that its entire body is one organ that constantly produces electricity. Regidrago, on the other hand, is made entirely from crystallized dragon energy. Regidrago is more interesting to me because, while yes, electricity is a naturally occurring thing, lightning strikes are real, but dragon energy? This implies that dragon energy is a force of nature in the Pokemon universe, as physical as rocks, ice, and metal. But this video isn't on Regidrago, so I'm not going to go too far into it. Regieleki is also pretty interesting. Its dex entry says that removing the bands on its body will unleash its true potential, meaning that these are holding it back. Now, none of the other legendary titans have these kind of bindings. Regigigas has these gold accents, but I don't think those are bindings. So why would Regigigas give it to Regieleki specifically? Well, one theory I've heard is that he didn't. It was actually given by humans after Regieleki terrorized them. If it is truly this powerful and dangerous, Arceus might see this as too far gone. After all, creating life could be bad, but creating life that goes about causing this much havoc is an entire thing entirely. This could also explain why the Reggies are sealed away in these temples with incredibly complex entry requirements. The humans have sealed it away. Perhaps sealing them in temples is the stock standard way to seal away a legendary titan. And the reason Regieleki has these bands on it is because it kept escaping, slipping through the little cracks. After all, being made of pure electricity is not nearly as solid as rocks, ice, or crystallized dragon energy. So without a solid form, it needed the restraining bands to give it something solid and physical to keep inside the temple. Sorry if that seemed a bit rambly, but it was the best way that I could use to describe it. So, if the difference between humans making new Pokemon and Regigigas making new Pokemon is how destructive they are, then why is humanity not punished for creating Mewtwo? Well, I have a couple theories. One of which is that Mewtwo is kind of not really its own thing. Rather, it's made from combining the human DNA with the DNA of the mythical Pokemon Mew. Since these are both already living creatures, this makes Mewtwo less of its own thing and more of a hybrid of some sort. Another theory I have is that the act of creating violence is not what sparked the punishment, but rather the guilt. Mr. Fiji, a character that is heavily implied to have been involved with the Mewtwo project, seems to have felt so guilty in creating Mewtwo that he gave up on Pokemon battling and science altogether. But I'd like to look more into the places where you can find the Reggies. I've been calling them temples this whole time, but they're really more just tombs or even simple caves. Snowpoint Temple, however, well, it's in the name. Dictionary.com describes a temple as an edifice or place dedicated to the service or worship of a deity or deities, and an edifice erected as a place of public worship, a church, especially a large or imposing one. So even though pop culture has made the word temple into simply a really, really ancient building, with it housing this ancient legend with connections of the Pokemon equivalent of God, I'd like to think that this place was, at some point, used for worship, likely for Regigigas itself. Maybe the Reggies were originally created to help people. So, the humans, as an act of gratitude, erected the temple to worship Regigigas. but at some point the Reggies attacked. This could be an interesting connection to Prometheus, who stole fire from Olympus to give it to humans, only to be punished by the gods for it, with it paralleling with how Regigigas made the Reggies to help people, but eventually, once Arceus decided that they were dangerous, it cursed Regigigas with never being competitively viable. Or maybe it takes themes from eldritch horror, one common trope being so large and incomprehensible that even thoughtless actions from this higher being impacts humans greatly. In Regigigas' case, this would be creating titans on its own whim, and humans made a temple in order to please it, even though Regigigas barely knows that they exist. Or perhaps Regigigas' actions in creating the Reggies were much more human. In the story of Frankenstein, the creature asks, begs, even threatens its creator to make it a companion. Because of its hideous form, people run and scream when they see him, with the only human treating him fairly being an old blind man. When the creature becomes depressed and believes that a companion who looks similar to him would not treat him as harshly, the doctor refuses to make him a companion, fearing that it would aid the creature in his reign of terror. This helps portray one of the major themes in the story, being it's not what you look like on the outside that dictates someone being human, but rather their actions, their wants and needs. Just ignore all the people that the creature killed. Comparatively, Regigigas may have simply been lonely, creating the legendary titans with faces similar to its own to help cure its loneliness. And Arceus, horrified by this, cursed Regigigas. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's somewhat similar. Another thing I'd like to mention about Regigigas is that it seems to have two faces. The first people likely see is the 6 eyes on its chest, which I would like to point out matches the colors of the 3 original Reggies. But if you take the other 5 Reggies and their weird faces into account, this yellow bit with a bunch of dots on it could also be seen as another face. This, along with its connection to Arceus and other religious stories, invokes the idea of biblically accurate angels, beings with hundreds of wings, burning wheels, and many, many eyes. And while Regigigas doesn't seem to have any wings or rings, having multiple faces with an abnormal amount of eyes, at least I'm assuming the dots are eyes, invokes something similar. As I mentioned earlier with the color schemes, this definitely gives it some kind of ethereal and strange connection to Arceus. This ropes it back together with the eldritch horror inspiration I mentioned earlier, as well as some connection to the Ultra Beasts, most of which also have no visible face. And while I haven't touched on it much, I do want to mention the designs of the Reggies, both because it seems important to the subject, but also I'm an artist, so I'd say a good design is really important. And the Reggies obviously do a good job of conveying the element they're made of, except maybe Regidrago. They also do a good job at all having a unanimous base, being a round-ish body with 2 stubby little legs and 2 large arms. Regigigas is also really interesting design-wise. Despite being forced to be pretty small because of the game's mechanics, having been able to fit on what is effectively a basketball court with a good amount of space to move around, it feels large and imposing. I can't remember who said it, but I once heard someone say that you can tell what kind of personality a character is by their silhouette, vaguely making a circle, rectangle, or triangle. Their circular characters usually end up being friendly characters. Think Mike Wazowski. Triangle-shaped characters can be sly, cunning. Think like Dr. Doofenshmirtz. And rectangular characters are sturdy, solid, and loyal. Think like Sully from Monsters, Inc. Regigigas is absolutely the rectangular one, and while it isn't exactly loyal, although there isn't much evidence to prove that it isn't, Regigigas is absolutely a sturdy Pokemon, all with the exception of not having the sturdy ability. On top of that, the geometric black markings, greenery growing on top of its body, and uncanny multiple faces, these do everything it can to show that this is an ancient, long-forgotten Pokemon. On top of that, these black markings almost make me think of Unknown, another Pokemon that is very closely intrinsically connected to Arceus and the creation myth of the Pokemon universe. On top of all that, the Reggie's faces, made of markings, being made from mostly natural material and being created by a creature closely connected to Arceus, also makes me think of the golem in Jewish folklore. These constructs, usually made from mud or clay, and created by some sort of religious figure as a guardian. One of my favorite Pokemon, Golurk, is inspired by this exact thing. So if this is the case, then the religious leader is Regigigas, which as I said, like a broken record in this video, relates back to Arceus. But if this is one of the inspirations, then what are the Reggies protecting? And from what? Well, I'm going to sound like a real mad conspiracy theorist, but hear me out. Regigigas created the Reggies, the first three at least, as a way to protect the people of Hoenn from Rayquaza. I will admit the evidence for this is a bit shaky, but hear me out. The Reggies are originally found in Hoenn. We all know that. We also all know that Rayquaza is not afraid to use violence to achieve its goals, evidenced by its encounters with Deoxys, and while the manga isn't exactly canon, does stab Zinnia as it sees her as unworthy. But for most of the part, Rayquaza stays out of human affairs. However, maybe something similar happened in the past. This would cause Regigigas to feel the need to take action, and created Regirock, Registeel, and Regice to counter Rayquaza, which each of them having some sort of type advantage against Big Ray. Regirock's Rock-type moves are super effective on Rayquaza's Flying type, as well as resisting Flying-type moves. Registeel resists both Rayquaza's Dragon and Flying moves, and Regice's moves hit both Rayquaza's Flying and Dragon types for super effective damage. And while we're at it, we might be able to fit the other two Reggies in here as well. Regieleki hits Rayquaza for neutral damage, but resists Rayquaza's flying moves, and while Regidrago is weak to Rayquaza's dragon moves, it can also dish out super effective dragon moves into it. And if this is so, this would also fit our Prometheus inspiration, as maybe Arceus, who created Rayquaza, got angry that Regigigas created beings meant to counter Rayquaza, who is meant to serve as a protector, and punished Regigigas. As I mentioned before, this is almost certainly not what the developers were planning, but it's fun to think about. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is all speculation and should be taken with a grain of salt. Regigigas and its children are super interesting Pokemon to theorize about, mostly because of their ambiguity. Almost nothing is set in stone, or steel, or ice. So, just like how Regigigas molded the Reggies, its lore is still pretty malleable. But if we take a step back and admire our work, we can see some pretty cool stuff. For example, Regigigas is most likely a melting pot of a bunch of different religious stories, including Prometheus, the Tower of Babel, the Jewish Golem, etc. Almost certainly has some sort of connection to Arceus, and the Reggies are a story, a warning of sorts of the dangers of playing with the strings of life. But what do I know? I'm just a broke high school student with way too much free time.